Hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving off my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. Nino Kuni. While I'm not a diehard fan for it, it's something that I do enjoy. With 2 solid games and an okay movie, I'm surprised that more isn't done with it. What about the mobile game? I don't deal with scams and or garbage. So hey, future me, I forgot to mention something called Hot Stories. Yes, we'll get to talking about that name in a bit. But in any case, it was actually a mobile game that was actually a prequel to both The Wrath of the White Witch and this version we're going to talk about. Sadly, it's a part of lost media. Most likely we will never see anything about it ever again. However, what we do know is well, again, it's a prequel to Nino Kuni, and it had the weird art style that is similar to the Mother series. Yeah. Which, that in and of itself is a weird thing, because you would think that most Mother fans would actually try to learn more about this game, but no. Which is sad because, again, it's a lost media. We can't find anything about it. Anything we have found is just through good luck. In fact, I know one person, Suzuki, on the Nino Kuni Discord server, which I actually join, and pretty much everyone there is really nice. If you like Nino Kuni, you should go there. Not a sponsor. I know that sounds weird, I'm just saying that, but seriously, go there if you like Nino Kuni. But seriously, both games are really good. Wrath of the White Witch is still worth playing today. However, one thing most fans don't even know is that the Wrath of the White Witch is not the first game. Because you see, the first game actually is a DS game called Dominion of the Dark Djinn, or Jet Black Mage. I prefer the former because it's just a cooler name. It never got translated for years and only got one like 2 years ago. Heck, I originally planned on reviewing it when it came out. However, I lost the footage and all my reviewer notes are gone, so had to redo it. But hey, it was still a good time enough to make me say, hey, I don't mind playing it again. Which is actually a high mark for me because I don't like replaying games much unless it's really good. Or out of spite, but I promise you it's not that. But let's get talking to about why does this game exist? Well, apparently it exists as a sort of 10-year anniversary for the developers of the game, Level 5. Which, if you don't know, made the amazing Dragon Quest 8 and 9, which I really do love, and also the Professor Layton and the Azuma 11 game. You know, the football one. And yes, it is football. And you will not stop me, America, because you're the weirdos here. Which, by the way, at the time of this video, those 2 series are coming back, which is awesome because I was a fan of the Professor Layton games, or at least some of them, but still awesome. In any case, it was a game made to be all about that adventure, which it does well in a sense which we will get into more in a bit. It was also decided later on it would get a PS3 version after the DS version was finished. However, one of the oddities of this was, rather than making a straight up transplantation of the story, it's more the same story axis, meaning while things are similar and the story beats are similar, they do diverge greatly at story points, at times, which we will see as we get into the review of Nino Kuni, Dominion of the Dark Djinn. The game begins with Oliver, our main character, getting groceries for his mother in his hometown of Detroit. God dang it, that name is just so bad, but it's also so good at the same time. It's just so funny. The town has a very, very Leave It to Beaver-esque feel, which ironically I did watch as a kid. It was before the morning cartoons. I woke up way too early at times, so I had to watch it just to literally do anything. Though speaking of cartoons, we do need to talk about Ghibli. You know, that company that makes the so-called great movies. Yeah, I'm just not a fan of their movies. I will say they have a nice looking style, their music's okay, not my particular thing, but their plots, to me at least, are like, they're interesting at first, but then after a while they kind of just lose focus for a little bit. And it's really not helped with Miyazaki being kind of a jackass. I mean, like, he basically says that video games are a waste of time. That is a straight up fact. He has said that, And he hates, like, a lot of other stuff that kind of feeds into my idea that he really is a technophobe. I mean, like, he did take out all the computers out of his company because he wanted them to be hand-drawn. Not to say that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that, come on, that's a little extreme. And if you're wondering, like, wait, if he hates games, why was this allowed? Well, it was mostly because he was in semi-retirement, it was a little complicated, but the point is that he wasn't in control at that moment. And I mean this, if he was anywhere near part of this, this wouldn't have happened. In any case, you generally know their style, and they really did a good job of copying that style to both versions, and they look great. I was actually surprised of how well they captured the look of Ghibli in the DS version, with a lot of varied models in each town, which will only ever be seen in those towns, which is really nice. Heck, the DS version has voice acting, which they really did take back to the PS3 version, which is really cool, because I was a little surprised to learn that the DS game had voice acting to begin with. I mean, like, it wasn't a rare thing when you actually start thinking about it and think about the games that did have it, because there were a lot of them for some reason. On his way home, he meets up with his best friend, Mark, and talk about how they're gonna need to show off their finished project. So they plan to sneak out that night, and we learn it was actually a car. But Mark can't fit into it, we'll get into that later, so Oliver tries it first. However, it doesn't end well, and he falls into the river. Luckily, his mother was looking for him because she couldn't find him at home, and was able to rescue him. However, tragedy strikes not soon after rescuing Oliver. She gets a heart attack, then soon dies. It devastates Oliver, and becomes mostly a wreck, unable to do much else. But suddenly, after crying on a toy his mother made for him, it slowly begins to transform and becomes Suzuki, High Lord of the Fairies. And, sorry, I just gotta mention this. He is such a jerk! Because he literally says, word for word, "Hey, Whip, why are you crying about your dead mom? I mean, like, it's only been 3 days. Come on, man. Seriously, who thought this was a good idea?" In any case, he soon tells us he's from the world of Nino Kuni, which is parallel to this world of Ichikuni. And that's because of the dark Djinn Jabal. More in a bit. Who was the one to turn him into a doll in the first place? And he's been causing havoc for the world, and Suzuki feels as though you can help, as you are the prophesied pure-hearted one, who will help save the world of Nino Kuni. However, Oliver rejects the idea of helping him. This will tie into later things, I'll get into it at the end, I apologize for that, but it works at the end. But that is until he learns about this sage, Alicia, who looks like his mother, and is possibly her soulmate. See, people in both worlds are connected, as they can share the same heart. And if one dies, the other dies as well, unless there's some weird circumstances, like with Alicia, who was sealed. So there is a chance for his mother to come back, and he quickly jumps on that opportunity. He soon acquires the Wizard Compendium and a basic wand to begin his journey to the world of Nino Kuni by drawing the Gate spell. Now here's where we get to talk about the Wizard Compendium. This is a book in both versions, however the DS version actually made a physical version, and yet, it looks cool and I want one. Anyway, the book contains spells that you will need for your journey, however there are a few snacks, though that's not without benefits. The first one being that it's just interesting to read, as it's not only just, the spells, but also just flattened out real stories in them, that contain lore bits and information about the world of Nino Kuni, which I find very interesting. And unlike FF13, I actually don't need to do this just to understand the plot, well, just some lore bits and some puzzles, but we'll get into that when we get into that. You can actually play the game and still understand the plot. And even though I said that, I need to also mention this too. Since it comes with the game, so I don't have much problems with it, I'm just more of an issue with how it's implemented. Like, for example, spells. Let's just say you want to use a spell outside of combat for a puzzle. You have to draw it. Every time. Over time, it becomes a very tedious process, as it's kind of a stopgap and just makes you have to look for something real quick, even though you know what it is, but you can't remember the symbol in and of itself because it's a little more complicated, because you need to draw the symbol in a particular way or else it won't recognize it for some reason. In any case, it's just annoying, and luckily it's not for combat either, because if you had to do that every time you needed to use a spell in combat, no, I would just say no. No. But again, it's not. It also requires you to translate stuff for the plot due to, again, well, plot stuff. Like needing to find out what this means. I get the idea and the appeal, it just doesn't vibe with me because it's just not my thing. I'm just really not into puzzles. But I will say that the puzzles are well designed. Like, they require you to really think about how you use these puzzles. Sure, they're a bit esoteric in some regard, like the ones in the dream world, which you only gain access to later on in the game, but is an interesting thing regardless. And also Miran's quest, which is actually more endgame stuff, we'll get into that in a little bit, but it's really interesting because it requires you to learn a lot of things through the book. Sure, it gives you hints, but it does give you the idea of what you need to do, which is really good because I suck at puzzles, and they usually make me feel dumb. I just want to repeat that I like the idea, and the idea is really cool. It's just, again, not my cup of tea. In any case, after a bit of exploring, we meet this tree duck guy, and you will never convince me he isn't one. He helps us with giving us an Djinn. Oh no. The Dino Lighter's gonna come soon! Run! Okay, serious talk here. These are the creatures we will use in battle, which we will get into now. So combat is unlike the PS3 version for obvious reasons, but honestly it could have worked since all honesty the gameplay works better there than in the PS3 version, which we will talk about at the end of the combat for the DS section. So here's how everything works. First off, you are on a grid where you can have up to 3 members in battle, and can switch out members if you want. However, you can only do this once a turn. Enemies can come in a group of 1 to 3, though in the later half of the game, they will just come in packs of 3, except bosses because they're bosses. However, there's an oddity. As I mentioned before, you walk on a grid. However, your opponents work on a line. Sort of, I'll get into that when I get into that. In any case, the grid. As I mentioned before, you can place your team members wherever you want. However, there are bonuses if you place them just right. For example, you place one in the front, they'll get a damage bonus. Or if they're in the back row, they'll get a defense bonus. And if units are in front of another unit and they're using a certain attack, they can actually eat up that attack and keep safe another unit, depending on what type of attack it is, though it's a little hard to tell which moves will pierce through, and there are row attacks which will pierce through regardless, but it's still interesting enough. Now the enemies, as I mentioned before, are in a line, meaning if you have a line hitting attack, you will hit them all, and columns are just essentially harder hitting moves. You might be wondering, why is it like this? Well, that's actually because the moves were also balanced to be against other players. Yeah, kind of like Pokemon, which is kind of like not an unfair comparison in a way. Because yeah, you can battle against other players, but I mean like that's not possible anymore, but still. And also like Pokemon, there are element types in the game. However, they're a little more simplistic and are fine. Though lightning works a little differently, as lightning doesn't deal a lot of damage, but it does have the cool effect of, if it's used against an opponent before they're attacking or guarding, well, you can actually cancel their guard or attack, which is really interesting in a way. I sadly rarely ever get it to work, but when it did, it was interesting. That's a good chunk of how the combat works, but we'll still need to talk about a few more things. Now I want to talk about my problems with the PS3's combat. Basically, my biggest problem is trying to be both an action game and a turn-based game at the same time, but not understanding why those two don't work well with each other. You have less control overall, and when you have AI team members, it's more complicated because they might do something stupid and you really don't want them to do that. And it's very overall slow, and I just don't like that feeling. But the one thing that made me really not like the PS3's combat is just how much harder it is just to recruit new Djinn, or familiars. Because you see, in the PS3 version, it is super hard to gain new team members. Like, some of the chances are really, really low. Like, 4% in some cases. Like, no, that's just wrong. Like, I remember a lot of my playthrough through the original Nino Kuni was just annoying because that capture rate made it impossible to capture new team members, thus it was hard to experiment. Meaning that I felt that the capture part of the game just felt pointless because if you're not going to give me a good chance of capturing something new, why are you bothering with all this? The DS handles this very much better by making the chance actually reasonable, and the only real requirement is having Marie out in combat to charm them into joining you. Which is, again, way easier. Though I say that, I actually had the opposite problem of the PS3 game, where I wanted to experiment in that game. The problem is, I really didn't want to experiment in this game. I think it's more because none of their designs ever gave me that wow factor. Like, they look all fine, but nothing really made me say, I want that guy in my team. Except Slink. I don't know why, I think he's cute. And I had my favorites, but they were all I used, and heck, even then, not really, due to how easy the game is. And I'm not saying that's a slight against the game because it seems to be more aimed towards kids. I'm just saying that, it is just how it is. And that still doesn't change how solid the combat is. It's just that once I had my main crew, I pretty much won the game. Sort of, I'll get into it. And I mostly won with Oliver, Might the Mighty Might, and Twig the Driplet. They handled everything I ever needed. Oliver has just a vast amount of magic that he never really needs to worry about, not being able to do something. Might was the physical tank. He can always deal damage with some fire damage if he needed to, but also able to defend other characters if I needed him to do so, which I usually did. And Twig would use water magic and healing magic, so I really didn't need to ever worry in combat much. But the odd thing is, I'm never actually sure if I was ever too good, or the enemies were just too bad, or if the scaling was just really off. Let me try to explain. This game has some weird stat distributions. I really don't get why. Like, for the most part, you'll gain 1 to 5 stats every level up. Then suddenly, all of a sudden, it'll go up by something like 20 or 30. And I have no idea why it does that. It just does that. I'm pretty sure petting them and doing other stuff with them doesn't increase it, which, yes, it did that before Pokemon did in Gen 6, which is impressive if anything. And sure, you can feed them stuff that would impart stat bonuses. They weren't actually affecting the rate it would go up. There's also equipment, which is interesting as certain Imagines can only equip certain items, thus it's kind of like you need to figure out what you want them to particularly focus on, since they also import them with special abilities. But I'm also pretty sure it didn't affect the growth rate at any point. And that was mostly all the gameplay in a nutshell. While there is more to it, we'll get to that when we get into that. In any case, after meeting the Duck Tree guy, and no, I'm never going to stop calling him that, we go to the Catnap Kingdom. Okay, it's time to talk about the name changes. So the PS3 version decided to change everyone's name, which, for the most part, they're pretty good, except for one change which I'll need to talk about later because it's tied into the plot. I honestly would use them, but for the most part, I'm just gonna stick with the DS names because I'm just more in tune with that one for the moment. So sorry if I confused the characters for you in a bit. In any case, while there, we learn about the ways that Jabbo is affecting the world by making people hollowed or broken-hearted. Basically, Jabbo, using his dark magic, is able to take a piece of a person's heart. However, with the heart locket, you can take someone else's extra heart piece to give to someone else who needs it. However, like I mentioned, you need to draw the spell every time you need to use it, and in some cases, you need to use it twice. because, well, there are multiple people who need the spell, so maybe you'll just, like, get the spell, take it from someone, then give it to someone else right near them, which is annoying. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't do some of the side quests, sadly. You see, you gain side quests after doing the town, and the side quests can basically drop down to an item quest, a monster hunter quest, heart quest, and finally, a synthesizer quest. Yeah, you can actually make items in-game, and you never need to do it ever again, except for the one time it is ever required. And even then, it doesn't really need to be done since you will later on be able to buy it whenever you want. And I mean, sure, there are some cool recipes and they're all in the book, but my problem is more that you don't ever need to use it. Thus, in my mind, it's bad, since if you don't need it, why make it? I want to repeat that it's not a bad system, it just seems a pointless system. But with that out of the way, we've mostly talked about all of the gameplay, and it's time to talk about the story. I thought I would go on with a dissection of the story, well, sort of, but I decided not to do that as it would take too long, and would rather go for telling you what they did differently, as the plot is actually very simple, and they follow the same story beat. So after helping the king of the Catnap Kingdom, he basically tells you, yeah, if you want to go after Jabbo, you might want to go to the sages, who might be able to give you their power to help you out. And after helping him, with the help of Mary, the daughter of a sage, and Jero, the run-of-the-mill thief who's also the brother of a sage, they are soon able to defeat Jabbo, and the day is saved. As I mentioned before, while they have the same core structure of the plot, they differ in many ways. One of the bigger examples is just, the White Witch, who is non-existent in the DS because she was made for the PS3 version of the story, which actually caused a lot of lore changes. Like, these 3 bosses have totally different lore to them. And actually one of the cooler bits is that you can fight them however you want. Like, do you want to fight this pirate guy first? Then go ahead. You want to do the snake guy? Go right ahead. Which, going back to that pirate guy, I just realized in my script I didn't talk about him. You see, in the PS3 version, he's just wandering out in the sea. In the DS game, he actually has his own dungeon, which really confused me as why didn't they make him one? I mean, like, they got the same point, but still. And again, because of lore changes, they all interact a little differently. Which, speaking of, remember Jabbo? Well, everyone knows him as Shadar. However, here's the problem. You see, in the DS game, someone else is actually called Shadar. And he is the Eternal Mage, basically this really big bad in the game, who was sealed away, but you can fight him as an extra boss in this game, though I'll never be able to experience that in a bit. There are also some minor differences. For example, the Temple of Trials is actually different in the PS3 version. In the PS3 version, it's its own place, and was barely a dungeon, more of a puzzle trial, where in the DS version, it was its own dungeon with puzzles. That also shares space with the volcano level, but regardless. Like, these are the type of differences where you are kind of have to deal with, but overall, these places still hold the same idea of what they need to do. But however, here's my major problem. See, while I like both games overall, I'm going to say this. For all intents and purposes, the story is fundamentally better on the PS3 version, or the remaster, whichever one. It's just a matter of fact, it's able to do more with the story in general, but that doesn't mean it's because of the limitations of the DS. It's actually because of a few things the DS does for no reason. I do want to mention that I might be poisoning the well of our discussion, but I think it's some valid critiques in there that we do need to address. For example, the DS game has a jungle area that is pretty much completely useless. Like, all honesty, if it was removed entirely and was a straight shot to another area, it would have been better. It is overall fine, I guess. It just feels pointless. I'm trying to figure out what was even the purpose of this area, as there's really no reason why you need to be there. The only reason why I can see it exists is so that you can actually rest before going into the dungeon. But that's it. Though speaking on that dungeon, another thing that I forgot to mention for some reason, yeah, there was a weird shoot-'em-up area in the game. Like, it's only here and it's the only time it's ever required. Like, I have no idea why it's in the game. In fact, going back to those spells for a moment, because I really forgot about it too, my apologies, there are actually a few spells in the game that you can't use at all. But why is that? Well, that's because they are used for DLC quests. Yeah, there are DLC quests for this game, which are still accessible. It's just confusing on why. And I would have done them, but I really didn't care for this game's side quest, so I didn't do them. My apologies. I'm sorry for sidetracking there. I just wanted to mention it, as again, it's the only time in the game where this sort of thing happens. And I still don't get why. It was enjoyable, but still. Though going back to what I was talking about, the weird, needless sections of areas, the PS3 version actually combines this place with another place, well actually technically 3 places if you want to be technical, into one place where it ties all those story elements together, and ironically works far better in both a gameplay pace and a story sense. Though weirdly enough, it did leave out the point where Oliver actually got a rock thrown at him. Like, yeah, that actually happens in the game. There's also a weird issue, though I feel as though this is just a me thing and I'm more expecting something. But I felt like the DS did not want us to linger in a certain area for too long. Like, it wanted us to get out of here as soon as we could. I'll try to elaborate. So if you ever played the PS3 version and you saw these two, you might be like, who are these two? Well, I actually had the same question when I played, and was honestly confused as they have nothing to do with the plot, why are we focusing on them? However, these two are actually important in the DS game, as they were the only way they were able to progress with the Eye of the Storm. Yeah, instead of the fairy village, which works fine enough and is a change I'm okay with. I'm just more confused on the removal of the gambling and arenas sector. And no, I don't get why Jabbo allows Imogene battles during his conquest. I don't get it. I don't care to get it. It doesn't really mean anything. I'm not worried about it. I mean, like, I'm just more confused because, going back to what I was going on about, because they made the mountain cemetery area into the gambling den, rather than the town it was made for. And weirdly enough, going back to the Eye of the Storm, in the PS3 version, it's never addressed on how they dealt with it. They just continue on their way like nothing was wrong, even though Jabbo could just bring back the Eye of the Storm again. It's just gone with no reason of why it's gone. While the DS version actually makes it the goal to stop the Eye of the Storm by heading into the town and finding some fireworks to fight out the Eye of the Storm. And while there is a good idea of a story, it just feels rushed. Like, all the backstory behind it is thrown at you with no build-up or insight of these characters. It just flatly tells us what we are doing and what we need to do, because it's more focused on the conflict between Jero and Marie, which, while interesting as well, feels rushed as well. It just made me ask, why did they even bother? Though it's a little weird as well, that the PS3 version removes some context between the jewel hunt, where we need to figure out where the stones are, but the game forgets to give context as to why they have the stones, which I don't get why. Like, I want to just mention that I do like the DS story overall. They're both fine. It's just that the DS has more flaws than I thought it would have. Which do not make it bad, it just makes it less enjoyable as a whole. I want to talk about the Borg Empire. No, not those. Where the prince is a shambling wreck, but for weird reasons, the game doesn't want to give the context as to why. Well, sort of. It's a little more complicated. Well, the PS3 version ties it to the overall narrative of his lack of self-confidence. The DS handles it very differently. We never learn of his father or much of their past. The lack of self-confidence stems from his near assassination. Yeah, that happens in the DS game. That's also tied with a bit of the city getting attacked by Jabbo, which, yeah, that happened too. Here's where I could say the DS is better on this, where they tied that in better with him by making its connection tied to how that near defeat is making him second guess himself, and all he needed was a reminder of, hey, you got this. And I'm not saying the PS3 version handles it worse, I'm just saying that they're actually both pretty well done for what they are doing, and I enjoyed it very much so. And I think ironically it set me up to not like the next area more, because I now know that the next area does less. It kind of makes it like, what was even the point? Originally, one of my thoughts for this game was that they are both really good stories that you should still try, which I still hold that opinion. But I want to mention something that made me say why I said the PS3 version has the better story. And that's mostly how it handles Alicia's secret, which, while different, same idea. So in the PS3 version, after defeating Vileheart, who was holding the soul snare that held Alicia, we learn the truth of their battle. Alicia's plan was to destroy Shadar's soulmate. However, he was already ahead of her, as he knows the only person who can defeat him is his soulmate, as they are balances of light and darkness. And he's already killed his soulmate, which, if you're wondering how he's alive, well, he's immortal. Don't ask me how he got immortal. I don't ask. But his soulmate will keep coming back until he can be defeated. Thus, Alicia decides to go to the future to defend his next soulmate, but at the great cost of losing her own soulmate. And Shadar was also able to take her memories away as well. And now you can guess who Alicia is. She was actually Oliver's mother, meaning that his journey was actually for nothing. It's also not helped that he's also Shadar's soulmate. So if he kills Shadar, he will die as well, which makes him fall into a minor coma due to his stress. And it's not long until he is actually reminded by his friend P, who tells him about all the good he did for the world. And it reminds him that, yeah, she wouldn't want me to sit here doing nothing, and decides to keep on fighting even though what will happen to him. In the DS game, I'm sorry, I think it's told horribly, as it's just flat out stated. None of the fanfare, nothing really to it, just said straight out. And it's said to a character who can't really respond. And it's just like, why? And yes, it gets the same point across, but it does it in the worst way possible. Like, I wasn't expecting a Ghibli animation just saying what's happening here, but at the same time, this is one of your more pivotal themes, and you don't do anything with it. I don't want to end on a sour note, and I kind of want to actually mention a theory of mine, or maybe an analysis that I kind of realized during my writing of this script. No confirmation from others seeing if my idea is crazy or not, but hey, maybe you all can tell me what's wrong with it. So one of the things that stayed in my mind while playing this game was that initial rejection to the adventure. And while yes, it is also a refusal of the call, I think it's actually more than that as well. As you progress the game, you fight Nightmare, the manifestation of a hollowed heart. Whenever I looked at Jabbo, I always thought to myself, he actually has a similar look to something like those nightmares. Heck, his clothes glow in the dark, like the nightmares. And his final phase looks like a nightmare if it was given drugs. So an idea came into my head. Is Shadar also Oliver's nightmare? Essentially, the idea is that, well, again, this is also basic, like, no duh, is that this entire journey is about Oliver getting over the death of his mother, in the literal and figurative sense. And when I say in the figurative sense, I mean as in the story, in a small way, him slowly accepting it. Because remember, at the beginning of the game, he didn't want to do anything until the idea that his mother could come back. Then he reverted to his old self. And it was important that his friends reminded him of all the good he was doing. And that's what kicked him out of his funk. And I feel like, I don't know, that just feels really powerful in a sense, you know? That he finally gets over it and is able to move on. Looks at the fear that is in him. And just says, it's okay. At the end of the day, Nino Kuni, Dominion of the Dark Djinn, was a good game, overall. While I had my problems with it, and I still think the PS3 version is still the better story overall, I still think this game is worth playing. I think you should go out of your way and try it, if at least once. I'll see you all next time.